Tonight, we're wandering back to a time when the world smelled faintly of coal smoke, damp wool, and the faint ego of people who were extremely proud of themselves. A place where the fog rolled in before dinner, the lamps flickered with a sort of tired determination, and the wealthy were, well, doing everything in their power to make sure you knew they were wealthy. This is Victorian England, home of quiet streets, noisy fashion, and people who genuinely believed that owning a pineapple made them interesting. And as you're settling into bed, sinking into that comfortable place between alert and dreamy, we're going to drift through the ridiculous little habits that the richest Victorians loved to show off. Because if there's one universal truth across time, it's that some people cannot resist a dramatic entrance, or a dramatic coat, or an extremely unnecessary, very expensive imported carpet that no one is actually allowed to stand on. We'll move slowly, calmly, like we're wandering through a dimly lit Victorian parlor full of objects no one asked for. Every whispered fire crackle in the grate, every soft shuffle of fabric, every distant carriage wheel on wet cobblestone, it all builds the picture. A picture of a society obsessed with being seen, admired, and quietly envied, even if it meant spending a fortune on something as simple as a monogrammed hairbrush. Yes, that was a thing. But there's no need to rush. This isn't a lecture. This is a gentle nighttime walk through history, guided by Boring Owl, where the facts come wrapped in soft humor and the pace is slow enough to help your thoughts unwind. Let your shoulders drop a little. Let your breathing find its own easy rhythm. The Victorians certainly weren't relaxed, but you can be. Tonight's story is simple, just how far the wealthy went to prove they were, in fact, wealthy. Some did it through clothes so complicated they required multiple humans to attach them. Others built homes so stuffed with imported treasures that one sharp sneeze could have caused a financial crisis. And yet, somehow, they kept going, because nothing said success quite like having furniture no one was allowed to touch. As we drift through each part of their world, the chapters will link together, like rooms in one long, exaggerated Victorian mansion, one that probably has too many hallways and at least one decorative chair you're not supposed to sit on. We'll explore their fashion, their homes, their dinner parties, their hobbies, their servants, their public displays of prestige, and finally, the moment it all came crashing down. Quietly, of course. Even their scandals tried to be elegant. So settle deeper into your pillow. Let the world outside dim a little. And as you drift into the soft, cozy quiet of the evening, we'll step gently into Chapter 1, where the very first rule of being wealthy in Victorian England was simple. You had to be seen. Not admired from afar, not quietly respected, but seen, visibly, unmistakably present in the world, like a walking announcement of your own economic success. If a rich Victorian entered a room and at least 3 people didn't immediately think, there goes someone with an alarming amount of disposable income, they considered the day a failure. And so, visibility became an art form. It wasn't about simply existing in public. It was about curating your presence as though you were the star of a silent, slow-moving, slightly overdramatic play. Imagine them stepping out of their houses in the morning, dressed carefully and calculatingly, knowing that the streets themselves were stages. The foggy air of London was not a nuisance for the wealthy. It was atmospheric lighting. The clatter of horse hooves on cobblestone wasn't traffic noise, it was their background score. Even the smell of coal lingering in the mist felt like a kind of dramatic smoke effect meant to emphasize their silhouette as they passed. Everything became an opportunity to display a lifestyle that required at least 4 people to maintain it. The promenade became the perfect arena for this performance. Parks in Victorian cities weren't created simply so people could enjoy nature. They were there to enjoy each other, or to be more precise, to enjoy being watched by each other. Wealthy men and women took slow, deliberate strolls through Hyde Park or St. James Park, walking just fast enough to appear alive, but never fast enough to risk looking rushed, sweaty, or, heaven forbid, occupied with actual responsibilities. The whole point was to be present without appearing to try. Their walks were measured and graceful, the kind of pace you adopt when you want to seem noble, unbothered, and comfortably insulated from the chaos of regular life. And of course, every detail, from shoes to gloves to posture, had to whisper, "I am doing extremely well, thank you." Even their parasols became part of the performance, opening and closing like props in a silent ballet of refined, slightly bored elegance. Carriages were even better tools to be seen. They were mobile status statements, rolling through the streets like slow, luxurious advertisements. The wealthy didn't just ride in carriages, they displayed carriages. There were shiny ones for sunny gaze, somber ones for funerals, elegant ones for evening events, and an entire spectrum of options in between. The real trick was to pass through the right streets at the right time, ensuring that a maximum number of people witnessed your well-polished horses and your improbably clean wheels. Distinctive carriage designs became recognizable, like early versions of brand logos. People would whisper the owner's name with the same obligatory admiration that modern passers-by might reserve for a luxury car cruising by.
Even the way they sat in carriages was choreographed. A wealthy Victorian never slumped. They arranged their bodies as if a portrait painter were hidden behind every lamppost. Straight posture, chin slightly lifted, gloved hands resting lightly in view, expression serene but not too cheerful. Being too happy could look unserious, and appearing serious meant people might assume you were contemplating investments or the fate of the empire. Those were respectable thoughts. Smiling too widely, on the other hand, might suggest you'd just eaten something sugary and undignified. The routes of these carriage rides mattered too. The wealthy wouldn't simply take the shortest path from one location to another. They designed long, winding detours that conveniently passed through the busiest, most fashionable streets. If the journey added an unnecessary 30 minutes, that was even better. Time was not a resource they worried about, and being visibly unhurried was a subtle flex of its own. Of course, all of this being seen wouldn't have mattered without the right social locations. That's where the Victorian season came in, a structured calendar of events designed to keep the wealthy circulating like decorative fish in an expensive glass bowl. Balls, concerts, theater performances, and garden parties became ritual opportunities for flexing. Attendance wasn't optional. It was a civic duty of the upper class to appear at these events and serve as living advertisements for wealth. If they didn't appear, people might assume something terrible had happened, like a financial loss, a servant shortage, or the deeply humiliating possibility that their tailor had let them down. Social clubs offered another arena for strategic visibility. These weren't simple hangouts, they were gated communities of status, where the wealthy could congregate and mutually reassure each other of their importance. Walking into a club was like stepping onto a stage where everyone already knew their role. You were expected to perform wealth, taste, and exclusivity without appearing too eager about it. The furniture was plush, the lighting low, and the conversations carefully leveled at a volume that allowed everyone to hear you without acknowledging they were listening. And the moment you exited the club, walking back onto the street with that quiet, satisfied expression, the public became your audience again. For women, visibility operated on an even more intricate level. Their social presence required coordination, planning, and the occasional struggle with outfits that seemed specifically designed to punish movement. Walking gracefully in layers of fabric and structured undergarments was an art form that required practice and core strength. Yet many women executed it flawlessly, gliding like decorative ghosts through drawing rooms and sidewalks. Each step had intention. Look serene, look refined, look like someone whose greatest hardship today was selecting the right brooch. Even their entrances into rooms were crafted moments. They paused at the doorway, let the light hit them just right, took a measured breath, and then stepped forward with a calm dignity that suggested they were either extremely wealthy or suffering from mild faintness, sometimes both. Their goal was presence, soft yet undeniable, and a room full of eyes was simply part of the scenery. The wealthy also mastered the art of being seen without necessarily engaging with anyone. It's remarkable how much social power could be communicated without speaking. Sitting in a prominent location at an event, offering a subtle nod here and a brief, polite smile there, gave the impression of being connected, respected, and perhaps slightly too busy to hold a full conversation. They curated conversations too, gliding away before someone could say something tiresome. Being charming in short, controlled bursts became a skill. Too much interaction risked looking too eager, and eagerness was dangerously close to looking common. But visibility wasn't only about being physically present, it was also about being talked about. The Victorians understood that reputation traveled faster than any carriage. Having your name mentioned in the right circles was almost as important as appearing in them. A well-timed donation, a new piece of artwork, or a lavish party thrown for absolutely no reason helped keep their image circulating. Being seen through stories, even exaggerated ones, extended their influence beyond the physical spaces they occupied. The architecture of the era reflected this obsession with display. Wealthy homes were strategically positioned to face streets where the most foot traffic passed. Grand windows opened onto public view, inviting passers-by to imagine what luxuries lay inside. If someone happened to see a glimmer of gold framing, a chandelier reflecting lamplight, or a richly patterned curtain, all the better. The Victorians would have installed transparent walls if it hadn't been too scandalous. Privacy was admirable in theory, but visibility was priceless in practice. Servants played an important role in this performance too. They ensured that their employers' public presence went smoothly. Clothes were perfectly brushed, carriages were shined to mirror-like brightness, and calling cards were kept immaculate. Even the act of a servant opening a door at the right moment became a mark of refined living. The wealthy rarely appeared rushed because their servants absorbed the chaos of daily life, smoothing out all the little frictions that might disrupt the image of effortless elegance.
Visibility extended to simple, everyday objects. Pocket watches, canes, jewelry, hand fans, hats, gloves, and even scent choices became tools for signaling. A well-crafted cane wasn't just for walking, it was a portable symbol of taste. A pocket watch wasn't just for time, it was a subtle reminder that the owner had the means to own something delicate, precise, and expensive. Even gloves served as social markers. High-quality gloves implied you had hands untouched by manual labor. And if your gloves were white, well, that suggested you rarely touched anything at all. Public notes and letters became another way to be seen. Newspapers often included social columns that read like the Victorian version of an influencer feed. Announcements of who attended what, who wore what, who traveled where, all served to reinforce public presence. Some families did everything short of bribing the editors just to secure a mention. If a name appeared frequently, people assumed importance, and if importance was assumed, invitations followed. Being included in these write-ups created a feedback loop of visibility that the wealthy maintained with dedication. Even traveling became an opportunity for display. Wealthy Victorians used travel not for relaxation, but for reputation. Traveling with a luxurious trunk, stepping off trains with elegantly arranged luggage, or staying in fashionable hotels spoke loudly about one's financial comfort. They understood that being seen on trains was a perfect blend of mobility and prestige, a moving showcase that expanded their visibility across regions. But what made all this visibility so fascinating was the contrast beneath it. Beneath the polished surfaces and practiced smiles existed a quiet undercurrent of anxiety. Being wealthy meant constantly proving it.
A single misstep, a worn-out shoe, a delayed carriage, a hairstyle slightly out of fashion could spark whispers. The fear of appearing ordinary haunted many of them, so they performed endlessly, sometimes gracefully, sometimes absurdly, always striving to maintain the delicate illusion of effortless superiority. Visibility became a lifestyle. It shaped their days, their routines, their wardrobes, their hobbies, and even their movements. They curated their existence like an ongoing exhibition, crafting a persona that needed consistent upkeep. And although they'd never admit it, much of this effort was less about impressing the world and more about reassuring themselves that they still belonged among the elite. As we drift into the next part of this nighttime journey, we follow them deeper into the world of appearance. For what good was being seen without being dressed for the occasion? If the streets were stages, then fashion was their costume. And the wealthy Victorians, with their flair for drama and detail, perfected the art of wearing wealth as prominently as they displayed it. If the streets and promenades were the stage, then fashion was the costume, and the wealthy Victorians treated their wardrobes with the seriousness of performers preparing for an endless show. They understood, perhaps more instinctively than any era before them, that clothes were not merely clothes, they were economic declarations. They were identity statements. They were the Victorian version of walking around with a neon sign that politely whispered, "Yes, I am exactly as important as you think I am." And so, fashion became one of their most powerful tools for showing off. It's impossible to talk about Victorian wealth without confronting the sheer complexity of their clothing. Every layer, every stitch, every unnecessary piece of fabric served a purpose. Not a practical purpose, of course. This was Victorian society. Practicality was reserved for the lower classes, and occasionally the middle classes on days when they had no reputation to maintain. For the upper class, however, impracticality was the point. If you could wear something that made walking difficult, turning a challenge, and breathing slightly optional, it proved you had the money and servants required to handle such an outfit. Wearing difficult clothing was a subtle way of saying, "Look, I'm so wealthy I don't need to move efficiently." Women's fashion in particular demonstrated this philosophy to its fullest extent. There were corsets, of course, which shaped the body into an hourglass silhouette that had little to do with function and everything to do with aesthetics. But beyond that, there were layers, endless layers, petticoats, chemises, crinolines, bustles, underskirts, overskirts, and occasionally even more skirts layered on top just to make a point. The goal was to create a silhouette that looked grand, elegant, and slightly intimidating, like a decorative bell that had been stuffed with ambition. And then came the fabrics. The wealthiest Victorians adored imported materials. Silks from Asia, lace from France, fine cottons from India, velvets from Italy. The more exotic the fabric, the more impressive the statement. It wasn't enough to wear something beautiful. It had to be something that required a long, expensive trip across oceans. The idea that your clothing had traveled farther than most people ever would in their entire lives was deeply satisfying to the upper class. It suggested that you were living in a world where distance was no obstacle and that the empire existed partly to clothe you.
Patterns and colors added another layer of visual signaling. Bright colors were expensive, as they required special dyes. Deep blues, vibrant greens, rich purples, and luxurious reds became the unofficial palette of those with large bank accounts. If your clothing looked like it might cause temporary vision loss to passers-by, you were on the right track. Even the designs featured on the clothing carried meaning. Floral embroidery, intricate beading, and elaborate patterns all required hours of painstaking labor, a labor that wealthy Victorians gladly paid for because it meant their outfits could serve as small, wearable art pieces. Men's fashion might seem simpler at first glance, but it was no less performative. A Victorian gentleman's suit was tailored with an almost obsessive precision. Every seam had to lie flat, every button had to be polished, every fold had to be crisp.
If a wealthy man's suit failed to fit perfectly, it was considered less a fashion mistake and more a personal failing, a sign that he had neglected his duty to present himself as a polished representative of his class. Their outfits were often decorated with small, subtle indicators of wealth: a gold pocket watch, a fine silk cravat, a gem-encrusted tie pin, or a cane made from rare wood. These accessories weren't just fashionable, they were symbolic. A cane wasn't about walking. A pocket watch wasn't about telling time. A glove wasn't about keeping hands warm. These items existed to broadcast a message: I have the means to own things that serve no urgent purpose. But perhaps the most fascinating element of Victorian fashion was its connection to social rituals. Dressing up wasn't an optional activity, it was a daily requirement. Even the simplest outing required planning. If a woman planned to visit the market, she had a specific outfit for that. If she planned to visit a friend, there was another outfit. If she planned to attend a lunch, a dinner, an evening walk, a theater performance, or even a mildly important conversation, each event required its own wardrobe selection. The wealthy Victorian woman's closet wasn't just full, it was curated like a museum. This ritual extended into the home. Women didn't dress up only to go out, they dressed up simply to be indoors. Household dresses, morning dresses, afternoon dresses, reception dresses, tea dresses, ball gowns, walking dresses, visiting gowns, and dinner gowns filled their wardrobes. If that seems like too many outfits for one day, that was precisely the point. Changing outfits frequently was a way to demonstrate leisure. If someone had the time and servants required to manage several costume changes per day, it meant that they lived in a world entirely free from manual labor. The upper class also had to consider how long their clothing remained in fashion. Trends in the Victorian era shifted slowly, but they did shift, and the upper class paid close attention. A dress that was last year's style suddenly looked old-fashioned, and looking outdated was unthinkable. Your clothing had to reflect the present moment, not the past. It was a constant challenge, a battle between the desire for stability and the pressure to remain fashionable. For men, this tension showed up in small, almost invisible details: lapel width, sleeve length, cravat style, the angle of a top hat. The top hat, in particular, became a symbol of status. Some men wore hats so tall they looked like inverted chimneys, towering statements of social rank that made walking through doorways a heroic feat. Yet they wore them proudly, because height equaled importance. The taller the hat, the higher the ego. Jewelry played a major role in displays of wealth as well. Women often adorned themselves with necklaces, bracelets, brooches, rings, and earrings created from gold, silver, pearls, diamonds, and gemstones imported from distant colonies. Their jewelry boxes were filled with pieces that not only shimmered under lamplight, but also told stories of connections, prestige, and economic power. Wearing these items became a delicate balancing act, enough to look impressive, but not so much that people assumed you were flaunting. Though, to be honest, flaunting was exactly the point. Even hairstyles contributed to wealth signaling. Styling hair required time and assistance, especially for women. Complex updos, elaborate curls, ornate braids, and decorative hairpieces all took effort. The upper class had the luxury of time and the help of servants to create these styles. If a woman's hair looked perfect, it meant she had a team supporting her behind the scenes. If her hair looked effortless, that was even better, as effortless usually required the most effort of all. Perfume became an element of fashion, though not in the overpowering way we think of today. A soft, subtle scent signaled sophistication. Only the wealthy could afford quality perfumes, and they chose scents that suggested refinement: floral notes, gentle musks, delicate citrus. A heavy scent could be considered vulgar, so the goal was to leave a faint trace of presence, like a whisper that followed someone gracefully out of a room.
Even children were dressed according to strict fashion rules. The wealthy Victorian child looked more like a miniature adult than a playful youngster. They wore tiny, tailored suits, lace-trimmed dresses, and small versions of the accessories their parents used. Dressing children like this was a way of showcasing the family's wealth and taste. It also planted the idea that status was something to be performed from a young age.
Interestingly, one of the most distinctive features of Victorian fashion was how uncomfortable that often was. Corsets restricted movement, heavy skirts dragged on the floor, tall collars stiffened the neck. Shoes were narrow and pinched the feet. Men's high collars sometimes made it difficult to turn their heads fully, and yet discomfort became a symbol of privilege. If your clothing made you slightly miserable, it meant you were important enough that comfort didn't matter. You weren't walking long distances after all. You weren't lifting anything heavy. You weren't participating in the physical world in any meaningful way. Social gatherings created new layers of complexity. A ball required gowns with elaborate designs, often featuring sparkling embellishments that caught candlelight beautifully. Gloves became essential, and removing them had its own etiquette rules. Dinner parties demanded more refined attire. The clothing for these occasions often cost more than a year's wages for an average worker. But that was the whole point. The wealthiest people wore clothing so expensive that it served as a constant reminder of their elevated position in society. Fashion could also be weaponized. Wearing an outfit slightly more fashionable than someone else's was a subtle insult. Wearing something overly extravagant to someone else's event could overshadow the host, a terrible breach of etiquette, yet one that happened frequently. Fashion was a competitive sport. If someone arrived at a ball with a gown with more lace, finer silk, or more elaborate embroidery than others, it shifted the social balance. People took notice. Whispers circulated. Reputations were made and unmade in an instant. But even with all this extravagance, the wealthy Victorians had one more tool at their disposal: the ability to appear effortless. True elegance was supposed to look natural. The most successful wealthy individuals were those who made their outfits seem like a second skin, as though they simply woke up looking perfectly assembled. Of course, behind this illusion were teams of servants working tirelessly to prepare clothing, assist with dressing, fix hair, clean accessories, and adjust small details. This hidden labor made the wealthy appear more graceful than they truly were. The ritual of dressing also created an intimate connection between fashion and identity. Clothing wasn't just about covering the body. It was about presenting a version of oneself that fit the expectations of society. If someone dressed boldly, they appeared confident. If they dressed in muted tones, they seemed refined. If they wore imported fabrics, they looked worldly. Fashion became a language that required fluency, and the wealthy Victorians learned it well. As we drift deeper into this world of wearable wealth, another layer emerges: what waited inside the home. Clothing was only the beginning. Once a wealthy Victorian returned to their residence, the performance of wealth continued in a different setting. Their homes weren't merely places to live. They were curated exhibits, meticulously arranged to showcase taste, status, and the results of a lifetime spent collecting things. And so, in the next chapter, we step through the doors of the Victorian home. We move past the coats and gloves, past the polished boots and carefully folded parasols, and into rooms filled with objects that often existed for no practical reason other than to impress whoever walked through. Because if fashion was the introduction, then the interior decor was the speech that followed it, a deeper, more intimate display of wealth that waited quietly beneath the chandelier's glow. There was a particular moment in the Victorian world when showing off stepped away from predictable routines and drifted into something almost theatrical. If the mansions, the laced gloves, and the jewels weren't enough, there was still a grand stage left for the wealthy to parade themselves upon. That stage sat on wheels, rolled along the road, and rattled loud enough for entire neighborhoods to turn their heads. And so, tonight, we look softly into the curious ritual of the Victorian carriage parade.
It wasn't an official event, and no one printed schedules for it, yet it happened every afternoon in London and other busy cities. The wealthy brought out their finest horses, their brightest carriages, and their most decorative footmen. They didn't do this for travel efficiency or comfort. Instead, they did it for the same reason many Victorians undertook these extravagant habits, so others could witness them. Imagine the scene gently. The streets were filled with the usual city sounds. Vendors called out their goods, wheels clattered on the cobblestones. But then something changes. The familiar noises shift, and a distant rhythm of hooves begins to echo. People pause. They glance down the road. Maybe they step to one side just in case, and slowly the display begins. The carriages weren't all the same. Some were tall and shiny with polished brass fittings that gleamed when the sun hit them. Others were more like rolling drawing rooms with cushioned interiors, carved doors, and decorative lanterns. Horses were chosen with care, too. A wealthy Victorian would never dream of using horses that simply got the job done. They needed horses that looked powerful, elegant, and almost regal. Sometimes the horses wore plumes, bright feathers rising from their bridles, swaying softly as the animals trotted. A long plume meant a long purse.
The footmen who rode at the back were chosen for appearance just as much as skill. They wore uniforms with gold embroidery, tall hats, and sometimes even carried small staffs. The footmen weren't there only to help passengers climb down. They were part of the visual spectacle, meant to catch attention in the same way the carvings on the carriage did. A household that employed many footmen only made the message louder. We have more than enough resources. And at the center of it all sat the passengers, who pretended not to care that the entire city was watching them. They held themselves in calm, composed poses, gazing out the window or looking straight ahead. It wasn't polite to laugh or wave. That would show too much enthusiasm, which would spoil the illusion. The wealthy Victorians believed that appearing indifferent, completely detached from the excitement around them, was the final touch of sophistication. So they sat still, knowing every glance, every button, every seam on their gloves was being inspected by the passers-by. Carriage parades weren't only for afternoons. Some families preferred evening rides, when their carriage lamps could glow softly along the streets. Oil lamps would light the polished surfaces, creating reflections that made the entire structure shine. For a world that had no electric lighting on streets, these lamps were impressive. They created halos around the horses and footmen, a moving bubble of warmth in the cool evening air. Of course, all of this came at great expense. Maintaining a carriage required a coachman, groomsmen, stable workers, and constant repairs. Shoes for the horses wore out quickly. Wheels needed tightening. Leather straps needed replacing. Even feeding and grooming the horses was a daily commitment. Yet many Victorians paid for all of this without hesitation, because the very act of being seen was worth the cost to them. There were even unspoken rules about how fast a carriage should move. Going too quickly suggested impatience or urgency, traits the wealthy did not want associated with them. A slow, deliberate pace signaled ease, comfort, and the luxury of time. The slower the pace, the stronger the display. After all, someone who could afford to move slowly clearly wasn't worried about anything. Occasionally, families tried to outdo one another. If one household appeared with a new design of carriage or a larger team of horses, another family would soon step up their own display. The competition wasn't always friendly. Conversations would circulate during dinner parties. Someone might mention in a soft voice that the Ravenswood family had been seen in a carriage with 4 horses last week. Another guest might raise an eyebrow and say they heard the Montrose family was preparing a new vehicle with silver-plated lantern frames. Even in these quiet exchanges, a subtle challenge floated underneath. Carriage makers benefited greatly from this culture. They produced all sorts of designs, some practical and some completely unnecessary.
There were carriages with mirrors, curved rails, and intricate hand-painted flowers. A few wealthy individuals even requested custom crests on the sides, carved with curling motifs that represented their family history. When these carriages rolled down the street, children would point at them, admiring the bright shapes and patterns. To a child, they looked like magical moving houses. But it wasn't always showmanship alone. Carriage parades revealed something important about Victorian society. They showed how deeply people cared about reputation, appearance, and outward signals of success. Sitting in a grand carriage didn't simply mean owning a luxurious object. It meant standing, quietly but proudly, within a hierarchy that everyone recognized. And being seen in that hierarchy mattered tremendously. Even the routes chosen for these rides were part of the ritual. Wealthy families favored areas where the streets were busiest. They didn't want to ride through quiet lanes or empty roads. Instead, they selected pathways lined with shops, markets, and promenades. They wanted crowds, they wanted observers, and because many Victorians enjoyed people watching, there was never a shortage of spectators. Some people in the crowds reacted with admiration. Others reacted with curiosity. And a few reacted with a hint of amusement because they understood exactly what the wealthy were trying to do. Still, no matter the response, the riders maintained their straight posture, their steady expressions, and their unwavering composure. Eventually, the parade would fade. The carriages would turn onto quieter streets, heading back to their stables. The horses would rest, the footmen would step down, the lanterns would be extinguished, and the city would return to its usual sounds. But the display lingered in memory, and for many Victorians, that was the entire point. All of this brings us a little closer to understanding the world we're exploring tonight. In the Victorian era, wealth wasn't something to hide away, it was something to present, carefully and repeatedly, like a performance with its own rhythm and etiquette. The carriage parade was just one way the wealthy made sure their status drifted visibly through everyday life. And now that we've stepped through these streets and watched these slow-moving displays, we can gently drift into the next chapter, where the stage becomes even more dramatic. Because the Victorians soon discovered that their homes themselves could become showcases, and every visitor became an audience member without even realizing it.
There was a moment in Victorian life when showing off wealth no longer belonged solely to the streets. The grand carriages, the polished horses, and the slow afternoon rides were all useful for making an impression. But eventually, the wealthy wanted something more private, more curated, and more controlled. They wanted to craft an environment where every item in sight had a purpose, a story, and a quiet message about their status. And so, the drawing room became something much more than a room. It became a stage. The drawing room was often the first interior space visitors saw when they were invited into a Victorian home. It wasn't the kitchen, or the dining area, or any room that people actually lived in daily. Instead, it was a carefully arranged space reserved for receiving guests, holding conversations, and presenting a polished version of the household. Families curated their drawing rooms with the same dedication someone might use to prepare a museum display. Everything had to look deliberate. Everything had to convey refinement. Imagine stepping inside one of these rooms. The air feels still, as if nothing in the space has been touched recently. Sunlight slips through long curtains that reach from ceiling to floor. The fabric is thick, often velvet or heavy brocade, chosen not for convenience, but for effect. Patterns might show flowers, vines, or delicate scrolls. And in many homes, the curtains were chosen specifically because their colors complemented the furniture or the carpet. Victorians believed that every object should harmonize with the rest of the decor, even if that harmony came at a tremendous cost. The first thing most guests noticed was the furniture.
Victorian drawing rooms rarely held simple pieces. Instead, sofas and chairs were carved with intricate wooden designs, sometimes including swirls, leaves, or even small decorative figures. Upholstery came in rich shades of red, green, or blue, often with embroidered patterns meant to show the family's taste. Even the placement of each chair mattered. A chair that faced the fireplace indicated warmth and welcome. A chair angled toward the center of the room suggested engagement in conversation. Nothing was random. Then there was the carpet. Many Victorian families spent more money on their carpets than on their wardrobes. Carpets were chosen not only for comfort, but also because they signaled access to global trade. A carpet from the Middle East, for example, immediately told visitors that the household had connections to faraway markets, and that mattered deeply to Victorians because global trade was considered a mark of sophistication. Even if the family never traveled, their carpet told a different story. On the walls, guests often found portraits, not necessarily of family members, but sometimes of landscapes or historical scenes. Wealthy Victorians believed that owning paintings demonstrated education and culture, even if they didn't fully understand the subject matter. Many paintings depicted idyllic countryside scenes, rivers winding gently through fields, tall trees layered with light, or distant hills glowing with soft sunset colors. Other paintings showed historical figures, romanticized versions of ancient kings, queens, or warriors. It wasn't the accuracy that mattered, it was the impression. But what truly defined the Victorian drawing room was the sheer number of objects placed throughout the space. There were cabinets filled with porcelain figurines, small clocks, decorative vases, and delicate glass trinkets. Tables displayed shells collected from distant coasts, small sculptures, or carefully arranged flowers. Some families kept metal ornaments shaped like birds or leaves, polished to reflect the soft light. The goal was not minimalism. Instead, it was abundance, abundance arranged with care. One of the most important items in the room was the mantelpiece. It served almost as a small stage within the larger stage. Families placed their favorite possessions there: candle holders with tall, melted wax, miniature framed photographs, or perhaps a clock with a slow, steady tick. Wealthy families often commissioned mantel clocks with elaborate designs, using materials like marble or gilded metal. A mantel clock was merely not a timekeeper, it was a centerpiece, meant to draw attention without appearing too intentional. It's difficult to imagine now, but the Victorians often spent hours preparing their drawing rooms before guests arrived. Servants dusted every surface carefully because dust was seen as a sign of negligence. Carpets were brushed, flowers were replaced, lamps were polished so they would glow evenly. Even the smell of the room mattered. Some families used scented oils or potpourri to create a pleasant aroma: lavender, rose petals, or citrus peel. A good scent suggested calmness and class. Finally, when guests arrived, they were guided into this carefully arranged space, and the hosts waited for reactions, even if they never said so aloud. Guests were expected to notice the quality of the furnishings, the shine of the wood, the harmony of colors, and the presence of expensive items. Compliments were welcome, though modesty required them to be phrased gently. A guest might say, "What a lovely cabinet," or "Your curtains are quite fine." Everyone understood the deeper meaning.
It's easy to imagine that these rooms might feel stiff or uncomfortable. In many cases, they did. The furniture wasn't always built for relaxation. Some chairs were more decorative than functional. Sofas were sometimes too firm, and carpets, though beautiful, could be thick and uneven. But comfort wasn't the goal, appearance was. For the Victorians, the drawing room reflected their identity, their social position, and their understanding of the world. One of the most fascinating aspects of Victorian drawing rooms was the emphasis on conversation pieces. These were items chosen specifically to spark discussion. A brightly colored vase from Asia might prompt a guest to ask where it came from. A framed photograph of a distant monument could lead to a story about travel. A peculiar figurine might raise questions about its maker. All of this allowed the hosts to share small pieces of information that hinted at their education, connections, or experiences. It was a gentle form of self-promotion wrapped in polite conversation. Another interesting element was the piano. Many Victorian homes placed a piano in the drawing room, even if no one in the household played well. Owning a piano symbolized musical refinement, an important quality in Victorian social life. If a family had daughters, it was expected that they learn at least a few piano pieces. Playing a calm tune for guests was seen as charming and elegant. The music filled the room softly, adding to the atmosphere of composure and gentleness. A poorly played tune wasn't ideal, but the presence of the piano still served its purpose. Lighting also played a significant part. Before electric bulbs, homes used oil lamps, candles, or gas lighting. The glow from these sources was softer and slower than what we experience today. Shadows moved differently. Light pooled in warm pockets. The result was a cozy, dreamlike space that made everything look slightly more dramatic. This was another reason the drawing room became so symbolic. Its lighting made the room feel like a quiet performance, each item illuminated just enough to be admired. When families hosted evening gatherings, they often dimmed the lights intentionally to create a peaceful ambiance. The flickering of candles made glass ornaments sparkle. Shadows danced on the walls. Guests settled into the space, speaking in gentle tones. These gatherings weren't loud or energetic. They were slow, deliberate, and meant to demonstrate the household's sense of refinement. A well-hosted evening in the drawing room could enhance a family's reputation. While all of this might sound charming, there was also great pressure attached to it. Maintaining a drawing room was expensive and time-consuming. Some families spent money they didn't truly have, all in an effort to appear wealthier than they were. The competitive nature of Victorian society meant that falling behind, decoratively or financially, could lead to whispering among neighbors. People felt obligated to make their drawing rooms bigger, brighter, and more elaborate. What started as a tradition became an unspoken contest. Servants played an enormous role in keeping these rooms presentable. They cleaned, polished, arranged, and organized. Without them, the illusion of effortless beauty would collapse. But servants were rarely acknowledged directly in social settings. They moved quietly through the space, making sure everything looked perfect without drawing attention to themselves. Their presence was almost invisible, yet essential. There was a curious etiquette to how guests interacted with the drawing room. They weren't supposed to touch too many objects. They shouldn't rearrange anything. They sat properly, spoke gently, and admired the space with polite interest. A guest who leaned too casually on the furniture or picked up a fragile ornament without permission risked raising eyebrows. Victorians valued appearances so highly that even guests were expected to play their part in maintaining the aesthetic. It's interesting to think about how different the drawing room was from the rest of the house. Many Victorian families lived in more modest ways when guests weren't present. Kitchens were busy and warm. Bedrooms were practical. Even hallways could be cluttered or narrow. But the drawing room existed in a kind of bubble, a separate world crafted for visitors, not daily life. Families entered it only when necessary, keeping it untouched most of the time. This contrast tells us something meaningful about Victorian culture. The drawing room wasn't created for comfort or convenience. It was created to project an idealized version of life. And in doing so, it revealed how deeply Victorians valued perception over reality. Their wealth wasn't simply measured by money, it was measured by how convincingly they could present themselves. As time passed, drawing rooms grew even more elaborate. New decorative items became fashionable. New colors came into style.
Families updated their furnishings to keep up with trends. Some households hired decorators to guide them in choosing the perfect arrangements. Entire industries emerged to support this need for display. Carpet makers, furniture designers, porcelain workshops, and framing services. The Victorian obsession with decoration became a form of business. And yet, despite all the pressure and expense, many families felt a quiet sense of pride when they stood in their drawing rooms. They believed they had created something beautiful, something worth showing, something that reflected their achievements. Even if the display wasn't entirely practical, it still gave them a sense of accomplishment.
Tonight, as we imagine ourselves stepping back from the polished surfaces and delicate trinkets, we might feel a kind of calm wash over us. The drawing room, despite its purpose, becomes a soft, peaceful space in our minds. The faint glow of candlelight, the gentle hum of conversation, and the stillness of carefully arranged furniture all blend together into a soothing picture. And it's from this gentle picture that we will drift into our next chapter, where the Victorians take their love for display beyond their homes and into the world of clothing, another stage where every detail mattered and every choice spoke softly about status. There was something almost theatrical about Victorian clothing, especially when worn by people eager to communicate their social standing. Today, we slip into clothing because we like the fit or the color or because it's comfortable. But in the Victorian world, clothing wasn't simply clothing. It was a coded message, a slow-moving announcement, and sometimes even a challenge. Someone walking down the street in a well-chosen outfit carried with them an entire vocabulary of style that others immediately understood. Fashion, for the wealthy, wasn't only about expression, it was about carefully orchestrated performance. Victorians understood that a person could speak an entire paragraph without opening their mouth. Every button, every fold, every layer, and every bit of stitching could signal something: wealth, taste, education, or ambition to rise in society. And so this chapter drifts us calmly into the world of Victorian attire, where clothing served as a silent but powerful display of status. We'll begin with the simplest truth. Victorian clothing was heavy, very heavy. You didn't just slip into a dress or pull on a jacket. You built your outfit, layer by layer, piece by piece, item by item. Wealthy women often started with several undergarments, including corsets, petticoats, chemises, and sometimes crinolines, which were hoop-like structures that puffed out their dresses. These underlayers created the famous Victorian silhouette, wide, rounded skirts that swayed softly when a woman walked. The more layers, the more impressive the shape, and of course, the more expensive the effect. A woman of wealth didn't walk so much as glide. Her skirts moved in gentle waves. The fabric rustled quietly, almost like leaves shifting in a breeze. This sound was unmistakable. Anyone nearby could tell that the woman approaching wasn't wearing something simple or casual. She was wearing money, carefully stitched, pleated, and ironed into place. Men's fashion, though far less complicated structurally, played its own role. Wealthy Victorian men wore tailored suits with tight waistcoats, crisp collars, and precise lapels. Their clothing emphasized cleanliness, discipline, and form. A man's appearance told others whether he was established, ambitious, or leisurely. A perfectly tailored suit suggested confidence and prosperity. A slouching fit or wrinkled fabric suggested the opposite. And so each day, wealthy Victorians woke not only to the weather or their morning tea, they woke to a decision: how to display themselves. In many households, clothes were prepared by servants. Dresses were ironed hours before they were worn. Shoes were polished until they shone. Gloves were brushed. Hats were reshaped and dusted. There was so much preparation that some families had entire wardrobes dedicated to their attire.
Closets were filled with dresses arranged by color and season. Drawers held lace, ribbons, and accessories. Hats sat on shelves like quiet sculptures. These hats deserve their own moment of attention. Victorian hats were often decorated with flowers, feathers, ribbons, and sometimes small artificial birds. Wealthy women loved wearing hats that bloomed with elaborate detail. A large hat was not merely decoration, it was a message of confidence and status. People noticed hats. They noticed the craftsmanship, the color, and the daring size. Even the angle at which a woman tilted her hat could say something about her personality. Men also embraced fashionable headwear. A top hat, for example, served as a sign of formality and refinement. A tall top hat suggested greater wealth, though the height needed to stop somewhere before becoming unintentionally comedic. The polished surface of the hat caught light easily, making the wearer more noticeable. And in the Victorian world, being noticeable was often the goal. Accessories were equally important. Jewelry wasn't worn just for beauty, it was worn for emphasis. A brooch pinned to a dress told onlookers that the woman had access to quality craftsmanship. Earrings sparkled in candlelit gatherings. A necklace made of pearls shimmered softly against a delicate neckline. Even the placement of jewelry mattered. Victorians understood that a piece worn slightly off-center could appear careless. Perfection was the ideal. Men also used accessories to signal wealth. A pocket watch served not only as a practical tool, but as a sign that the man valued punctuality and precision. A gold chain that connected the watch to a vest pocket displayed quiet affluence. Some men carried ornate walking sticks, not because they needed support, but because the stick added flair to their presence. Handmade lace was another treasured item. Lace was difficult to produce and expensive to purchase. Women wore it on collars, sleeves, and hems. The more delicate the lace, the more admired it was. Skilled lace-making required countless hours of work, often by artisans with years of experience. Owning real lace meant owning something rare and valuable.
But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Victorian fashion was the concept of seasonal showing. Certain colors and fabrics were reserved for specific times of year. Lighter shades appeared in spring, soft pastels in summer, darker tones in autumn, and heavy materials in winter. Families who followed these seasonal rules signaled their understanding of etiquette. Breaking these rules might lead to raised eyebrows, not because it was a severe offense, but because it hinted at a lack of refinement. And as we drift farther into the details, we find another important truth. Wealthy Victorians rarely wore the same outfit frequently. Repetition was considered poor form. Guests at dinners or gatherings noticed patterns. If someone wore a dress too many times, it suggested financial constraints. To avoid giving this impression, many families expanded their wardrobes beyond what was necessary. This practice placed enormous pressure on both money and time, but the display of wealth mattered too much to ignore. The servants who managed these wardrobes were often overwhelmed by the workload. They cleaned, brushed, stitched, and mended. They kept track of which outfits were suitable for which occasions. They folded clothes carefully to avoid wrinkles. They learned each family member's preferences, the texture of a favored fabric, the preferred color palette, the exact tightness of a corset. Their work was largely unseen, but it shaped the presentation that wealthier Victorians relied on. There was one more subtle layer to Victorian fashion that gives us a clearer sense of how display worked. Clothing was meant to slow people down. A wealthy woman in a large dress moved more slowly than someone wearing simpler clothing. A man in a stiff collar sat differently and walked differently than a laborer. This slower movement wasn't accidental. It communicated leisure and comfort, two luxuries not available to everyone. The wealthy also used gatherings as showcases for their attire. At dinners, parties, gallery visits, and concerts, fashion became its own kind of entertainment. Guests looked at one another, quietly noting new designs or jewelry. Compliments floated through the air gently, often wrapped in polite phrasings. "Your dress is charming tonight," someone might say, or "Your suit is quite fine." These remarks weren't simply observations, they were acknowledgments of effort and expense. And then there was the social competition. Families sometimes spent more on clothing to rival their neighbors or acquaintances. If someone appeared one evening with a particularly elegant gown, another family might respond with new attire the following week. This invisible competition shaped trends. It led families to invest in brighter colors, larger skirts, or more ornate embellishments. Tailors and dressmakers benefited from this constant demand. The wealthier the client, the more elaborate the design they requested. Yet despite all the competitive undertones, Victorian fashion had an undeniably charming side. Many people genuinely admired the craftsmanship of their clothes. They appreciated intricate patterns, fine stitching, and rich materials. For them, fashion wasn't only a display, it was also a quiet celebration of beauty and artistry. A household that embraced fashion believed that aesthetic refinement reflected their appreciation for culture and history. One of the most important social events tied to fashion was the Victorian promenade. This was a leisurely walk through parks or popular areas where people dressed in their best clothing. The promenade was like the carriage parade, only slower and more personal. People walked gently, allowing others to see their attire up close. Women carried parasols to protect themselves from the sun. These parasols came in elegant designs, lace, silk, or embroidered fabric stretched across delicate frames. A parasol that matched the dress showed attention to detail. Men walking alongside them wore their best suits or coats. They carried gloves and sometimes removed them before greeting acquaintances. Every gesture mattered. A gentleman who tipped his hat properly earned quiet approval. A woman who walked with graceful posture contributed to the elegance of the entire scene. The promenade became a kind of unspoken performance where everyone participated and no one acknowledged it directly. One might think this lifestyle felt exhausting, but many Victorians grew accustomed to it. They saw it as part of who they were and what society expected. Over time, the rules became second nature. Families passed them down across generations. Young people learned how to dress properly, how to carry themselves, and how to understand the subtle symbols stitched into every outfit. And yet, behind all the elegant fabric and polished surfaces, many Victorians felt a quiet sense of relief at the end of each day when the layers finally came off. Removing the heavy dresses or stiff suits allowed them to breathe more easily. Moving without restriction felt freeing. But the next morning, the cycle began again. Fashion in the Victorian world wasn't merely a matter of style, it was a language. A gentle, intricate, layered language spoken silently through fabrics and patterns. And like all languages, it required practice, it required precision, it required intention. This chapter leaves us with a soft understanding of that world, a world where walking down the street was a performance, where clothing carried subtle messages, and where wealth was stitched into seams and hems. As we let these images settle in our minds, we prepare to drift into the next chapter, where the wealthy Victorians didn't just wear their wealth, they purchased entire experiences designed to be admired.
There was a point in Victorian life when the wealthy began to realize that showing off their fortune required more than objects. They had already displayed their homes, perfected their drawing rooms, curated their wardrobes, and paraded through the streets in carriages that glittered under the afternoon sun. But the true masters of Victorian status knew that objects alone were not enough. To be fully admired, one had to be seen living a grand life, not merely owning it. This chapter brings us quietly into that world. into the era when wealthy Victorians purchased entire experiences, not just belongings. And in typical Victorian fashion, they performed these experiences with the same deliberate care as a well-rehearsed stage play. Let's begin with an idea the Victorians adored: the art of being seen in the right place at the right time. One of the most prestigious experiences money could buy was the opera. A night at the opera was not simply about enjoying music. It was about occupying a well-lit box where others could observe your poise, your dress, and your level of refinement. The wealthy often purchased season boxes, which were reserved seats that stayed theirs throughout the entire opera season. These boxes became small social territories. Owning one meant you had permanent access to culture, entertainment, and the subtle attention of your peers. Visitors entering an opera house would look carefully at the boxes, not the stage. They noticed who sat in which box, who entered fashionably late, and which families wore coordinated outfits. They studied who leaned elegantly over the balcony railing and who held their posture a bit too stiffly. Even the act of applauding became a kind of performance. A person who applauded at the right moments demonstrated good cultural training. Someone who clapped off-beat revealed their unfamiliarity with opera etiquette. The music mattered, of course, but sometimes only as a soft reminder that art surrounded the audience. In truth, the opera was a Victorian social arena, a calm spotlight where wealth was not shouted but gently suggested. Another cherished luxury experience was the gallery visit. Galleries during the Victorian period served as both museums and social destinations. Wealthier families often visited exhibitions, walking slowly from painting to painting with the serene confidence of people who believed culture itself was an accessory. They studied landscapes, historical scenes, portraits, and still-life paintings. But more importantly, they made sure every other visitor could observe them studying those paintings. Many Victorian gallery outings ended not with in-depth discussions about the artwork, but with subtle nods, murmured compliments, or quiet reflections designed to imply taste. Visitors might lean in to examine brushstrokes or tilt their heads while considering the lighting of a scene. The gesture itself, soft, deliberate, thoughtful, communicated refinement. Anyone watching would think they must be very cultured. It wasn't dishonest. It was, in its own way, a carefully maintained tradition. Victorians genuinely believed that appreciating art made someone more complete, more civilized, more elevated in spirit. So even if a gallery visit was partly performance, it also served as a gentle lesson in beauty, texture, and history. Concerts, exhibitions, literary readings, botanical demonstrations, and scientific lectures followed the same pattern. Events became opportunities for the wealthy to present themselves as intelligent and worldly. A person who attended numerous lectures could casually mention them during conversations in their drawing room. It sounded impressive, it sounded deep, and it placed them a step above neighbors who stayed home instead. But the wealthy did not stop at attending public events. They also hosted private experiences in their own homes. Evening gatherings were an essential part of this culture. Families invited guests to hear someone play piano, to sample a new recipe, to admire fresh decorations, or to enjoy a quiet night of conversation beside the fire. These evenings were serene, calm, and carefully balanced. Nothing was rushed, nothing was loud. A guest could speak softly without worry that their voice would be drowned out by chaos. In a way, these gatherings resembled the content of a soothing nighttime channel. Slow, peaceful, and designed to make everyone feel safe and pleasantly drowsy. Another extravagant experience was the Victorian dinner party. These dinners were elaborate and often quite long. Several courses were served, each matched with appropriate tableware. The arrangement of plates, glasses, forks, and knives looked more like a diagram of etiquette than a simple meal setting. Guests progressed through soups, roasts, pastries, fruits, and desserts, all prepared by skilled cooks who rarely received recognition in the moment. Hosts didn't simply buy food, they bought the moment, the ambiance,
the gentle dimming of candles as the evening moved deeper into night. They purchased an experience that gave guests something to admire, something to speak about afterward, something to remember fondly. A successful dinner created ripples in social circles for days, sometimes weeks.
And then, of course, there were travel experiences. Victorians began embracing travel as a way to demonstrate worldliness. Wealthy families took holidays to seaside resorts, countryside estates, or even distant countries connected by expanding railway lines and steamship routes. These trips were not rushed vacations. They were calm, slow-moving journeys where families enjoyed quiet scenery, gentle weather, and the peaceful hum of carriage wheels or train engines. When Victorians traveled, they sent postcards. They collected souvenirs, small shells, pressed flowers, bits of pottery, and displayed them proudly back home. A visitor who saw a seashell placed carefully on a mantelpiece would know immediately that the family had traveled recently. This in itself signaled both leisure and wealth. Travel journals became another cherished hobby. People wrote about landscapes, sunsets, the sound of waves, or the feel of mountain air. These descriptions were tucked into notebooks, saved for reflection, and occasionally read aloud to guests. Travel stories served as social currency. They proved that the family had experienced something beyond the everyday rhythm of life. The Victorians also adored exotic experiences, carefully curated encounters with cultures they found fascinating. Families purchased imported goods, attended exhibits featuring artifacts from distant countries, and sometimes hosted themed evenings that gently borrowed elements from global traditions. These experiences, while viewed differently today, represented a Victorian desire to explore the world through admiration and curiosity. They were fascinated by the idea of travel, even when their understanding of other cultures remained limited. Among the wealthiest class, one of the most extravagant experiences was the charity event. Attending or hosting charity balls gave wealthy families the appearance of generosity, compassion, and leadership. These events featured music, dancing, fine clothing, and polite conversation, all wrapped inside the noble intention of supporting a cause. Guests admired the hosts for their efforts, and the hosts in turn enjoyed the praise. The events had a soft glow to them, candlelight shimmering on polished floors, slow dances that floated gracefully across the room, and the gentle sound of conversation blending with the music. It felt almost like a dream, as if time slowed for just a few hours. The wealthy adored these moments not only for the admiration they brought, but also because the atmosphere was genuinely soothing. Another experience that the wealthy enjoyed was seasonal leisure. Summertime meant picnics on grassy hillsides where families spread out blankets, unpacked baskets, and spent long hours watching the clouds drift lazily overhead. Winter offered ice skating outings, soft carriage rides through snowy streets, or cozy gatherings indoors with warm drinks and gentle conversation. Autumn inspired walks through forests painted in golden and red hues. Spring tempted families into gardens filled with fresh blossoms and soft, warm breezes. These seasonal activities were calm, wholesome, and deeply satisfying. But beneath the serenity, there was always a quiet awareness that these experiences cost money. Money for travel, staff, food, leisure time, and the ability to step away from work without consequence. Only the wealthy had the luxury of spending hours in peaceful indulgence. And yet, for all their grandeur, these experiences shared one quality. They were designed to feel effortless. A well-planned picnic seemed simple. A dinner party felt natural. A promenade looked casual. But behind every moment was careful preparation, sometimes days of it.
Servants packed the baskets, arranged the tables, polished the silverware, tuned the instruments, laid out the blankets, and ensured that everything ran smoothly. They managed the details that made wealthy leisure appear magical. And though their contributions were often invisible, they shaped the rhythm of Victorian luxury. As we let these scenes settle quietly in our minds, we begin to sense the truth behind Victorian wealth. It wasn't only about owning expensive things, it was about orchestrating a life filled with gentle moments, curated beauty, and the feeling of being admired without ever seeming to ask for admiration. These experiences, even now, drift through history like soft candlelight, warm, calm, and slightly theatrical. And in the next chapter, we'll continue exploring how Victorians pursued admiration not through grand gestures, but through the subtle art of collecting the unusual, a pastime that allowed them to illuminate their homes and minds with curiosities from around the world. As the Victorian world grew increasingly sophisticated, the wealthy discovered that houses alone were not enough to demonstrate refinement. Houses could be grand, clothing elaborate, carriages polished and precise, and experiences meticulously curated. But true social distinction required something subtler: the ability to collect, display, and quietly showcase the extraordinary. And so the culture of curiosities emerged, a world in which cabinets, shelves, and rooms themselves became carefully orchestrated exhibitions of wealth, taste, and a mild fascination with the unusual.
At the heart of this practice was the cabinet of curiosities, or Wunderkammer, a tradition borrowed from earlier European elites. For the Victorians, these collections were a way to bring the faraway, the rare, and the unexpected into their homes. Shells from tropical coasts, preserved insects with delicate wings, small taxidermied animals, geological specimens, and exotic artifacts from colonies all found a place in these collections. Each item was carefully positioned to draw the eye, to spark conversation, or to subtly remind visitors that the collector had both wealth and access to distant corners of the world. Imagine a guest stepping into such a room. Their gaze is drawn first to the cabinets themselves, polished mahogany or oak, with glass fronts and velvet-lined shelves. Every door swings smoothly, every latch clicks softly. Inside, the objects are arranged with precision. Nothing is haphazard. The collector has spent hours determining what should occupy the central shelves, what should be elevated on tiny pedestals, and what should remain slightly shadowed, teasing curiosity. The experience is calming and intriguing simultaneously, as if the room itself is inviting quiet observation rather than loud admiration. It wasn't only natural curiosities that fascinated the wealthy. Technological oddities found their place too. Small clocks, mechanical automata, and instruments for measuring temperature, pressure, or distance became common features in these rooms. Some collectors displayed early microscopes, telescopes, or other scientific tools. Owning such devices suggested that a family was not merely wealthy, but educated, curious, and attuned to the modern world. It wasn't enough to purchase a gadget. The way it was displayed mattered. It had to look deliberate, harmonious, and refined. Many of these collections incorporated items that, by today's standards, might seem peculiar or even morbid. Small skeletal specimens, fossilized remains, or delicate preserved plants were admired not for shock value, but for their rarity and the skill required to obtain them. Each specimen spoke to the collector's knowledge, taste, and ability to invest in something few others possessed. Victorian sensibilities balanced delicacy and intrigue, transforming even unusual objects into quiet markers of sophistication.
Collecting was often a family pursuit, passed down from parents to children. Young members were encouraged to appreciate their inheritance, learn about the origins of objects, and understand the subtle language of curation. Teaching children to recognize and value rare items became a form of cultural education. Over time, the household's collection grew into an ongoing, ever-changing project, with new acquisitions subtly reshaping the room's atmosphere. Visitors would notice shifts, appreciating both novelty and continuity, often without realizing the intention behind it. Wealthy Victorians also used collections to demonstrate their access to distant lands. Many objects were imported from colonies, purchased through trade networks, or obtained via travel. A shell from the Indian Ocean, a carved figurine from China, or a rare gemstone from Africa carried implicit meaning. The household had the means, the connections, and the curiosity to explore worlds beyond the immediate neighborhood. Displaying such items quietly reinforced social hierarchies while inviting admiration from visitors. The arrangement of curiosities in the home followed unspoken rules. Items were grouped thoughtfully, often by type, region, or theme. Symmetry was prized, but so was a certain sense of discovery, a way for the eye to wander and linger. Shelves and cabinets were often illuminated by natural sunlight or soft candlelight, creating subtle highlights and shadows that made the collection appear almost alive. A small figurine might catch a glint of light, encouraging a guest to pause and admire it. These careful details were essential. The collector understood that presentation was as important as possession. Some collections expanded into entire rooms. Wealthy households might dedicate a full chamber to shells, fossils, or scientific instruments. Others displayed collections alongside their more general furnishings in drawing rooms or studies. In each case, these items were treated with care, dusted regularly, and arranged so that the visitor's attention could be guided gently from one point to another. A room filled with curiosities was both intimate and expansive, calming and exciting, a space where observation became a quiet pleasure. The act of collecting itself became a social performance. Visitors asked questions about the origins, rarity, or significance of each item. The host, subtly guiding the conversation, provided measured explanations, anecdotes, and insights. In this exchange, the host demonstrated knowledge, patience, and refinement. The conversation flowed slowly, deliberately, like a soft river, with no need for hasty judgment or overt praise. The interaction emphasized education, subtlety, and calm appreciation, the core values of Victorian sophistication. At times, collections were enhanced by carefully crafted labels, notes, or diagrams. These textual elements provided context without overwhelming the visual experience. A label might indicate the place and date an artifact was obtained, or describe a peculiar feature of a specimen. In some cases, guests could read detailed observations, gently guided through the intellectual and aesthetic significance of the items. This textual support added another layer of prestige and suggested that the household had cultivated taste and understanding.
The Victorian fascination with collecting extended beyond natural or technological curiosities. Artifacts reflecting human history, culture, or craftsmanship were highly valued. Small tapestries, ancient coins, pottery fragments, and carved objects allowed collectors to suggest sophistication, global awareness, and historical interest. Each piece was a conversation starter, and each conversation subtly confirmed the household's status. Interestingly, even the smallest items mattered. A single unusual shell, a rare fossil, or an exotic plant placed carefully in a cabinet could capture more attention than a larger, more obvious object.
The principle was the same as with fashion. Subtlety mattered. Wealth and taste were most impressive when presented as natural and effortless rather than brash or ostentatious. The collector sought admiration without shouting, creating a space where every detail communicated refinement. In addition to cabinets, many households maintained small curiosities on mantels, tables, and windowsills. Tiny collections of stones, shells, or miniature sculptures encouraged quiet discovery. Guests could wander slowly through the room, observing, pondering, and appreciating. The overall effect was calming and immersive, like walking through a carefully curated museum, except that it existed entirely within the domestic space. The influence of collecting also extended to gardens and outdoor spaces. Wealthy Victorians often curated gardens with exotic plants, rare flowers, and carefully arranged pathways. Statues, fountains, and sculptures were placed to guide the visitor's gaze. Even a simple stroll along a garden path became an orchestrated experience with visual cues designed to highlight taste, knowledge, and wealth. Gardens were an extension of the home's interior, an outdoor drawing room where social status could be quietly displayed. And yet, collecting had a gentle rhythm that harmonized with the Victorian temperament. Unlike flashy displays, it encouraged contemplation. Guests did not rush through a cabinet of curiosities. They did not speak loudly or touch items indiscriminately. They paused, they observed, they appreciated. The process itself became a form of quiet social interaction, a shared acknowledgement of taste, refinement, and intellectual curiosity. In this way, the act of collecting mirrored the broader Victorian obsession with calm, deliberate presentation in all areas of life. Wealthy Victorians also developed a subtle etiquette around gifts and acquisitions. A newly acquired object was sometimes presented as a gift to a friend, symbolizing both generosity and discernment. Receiving a rare object conferred prestige on the recipient, but also reminded everyone of the giver's resources and connections. This circulation of curiosities strengthened social networks, maintained hierarchy, and encouraged ongoing engagement with the world of objects. Through these practices, the Victorian home became not just a residence, but a living exhibition. Each room, cabinet, and display told a story about the family's wealth, curiosity, and cultural refinement. The quiet rhythm of observation, conversation, and appreciation created a calm yet socially charged environment where wealth was communicated through detail, knowledge, and careful curation rather than overt extravagance. And so, as we let this image settle in our minds, the gleaming cabinets, the carefully arranged specimens, the soft light illuminating the curiosities, we begin to see a larger pattern. Victorian wealth was not only about objects or experiences, it was about how life itself could be orchestrated in subtle, deliberate ways to communicate refinement, status, and control. The Victorian obsession with display didn't end with fashion, houses, or collections. It extended, quite seamlessly, to the table. Eating, in the world of the wealthy, was not merely a biological necessity. It was a performance, a carefully orchestrated ritual, and a subtle way to communicate refinement, taste, and social rank. In a way, the dining room became a stage and every meal a scene in the quiet theater of Victorian life. Imagine stepping into a grand Victorian dining room. The room is spacious, polished, and subtly illuminated by candlelight or early gaslighting, giving everything a gentle golden glow. The walls might be adorned with landscapes, portraits, or tapestries that harmonize with the table's setting. Long tables are covered in crisp, pristine linens that have been starched to perfection, their edges falling neatly to the floor. The tablecloth itself is an unspoken statement. Even the fabric communicates order, discipline, and wealth. The chairs are arranged evenly around the table. Each one is carefully polished, sometimes with intricately carved backs, and always positioned so that no one appears too close or too distant from their neighbor. Seating arrangements are deliberate.
A host might place family members, guests, and acquaintances in positions meant to subtly convey hierarchy. Senior members sit at the head or center, while new acquaintances might occupy places of observation near the edges. Nothing is accidental. Every detail contributes to the silent choreography of the meal.
The tableware deserved attention. The Victorians had a near-obsessive focus on porcelain, silver, and crystal. Plates were often hand-painted with delicate patterns, sometimes gilded at the edges, signaling refinement and wealth. Cutlery was arranged according to strict etiquette, each fork, knife, and spoon carefully placed to correspond with the progression of courses. The mere presence of polished silver utensils suggested that this was no ordinary meal. A simple fork could speak of status if it gleamed and was precisely aligned. Glassware played an equally significant role. Goblets and wine glasses were selected for both beauty and suitability. Crystal cut to refract candlelight added a soft sparkle to the table, creating a sense of gentle luxury. Each piece, positioned thoughtfully, contributed to an overall aesthetic that was calm, harmonious, and deliberately impressive. The careful arrangement of objects created a silent story. We live with refinement. We observe tradition. We value beauty. Food itself became a medium for subtle social display. Meals were rarely simple. They were composed of multiple courses, sometimes 5 or more, each served in a carefully timed sequence. Soup might open the meal, followed by fish, meat, vegetables, sauces, and pastries. Dessert was often a finale of sweetness and artistry. Each dish was not only chosen for flavor, but also for its visual impact. The goal was not merely to satisfy hunger, but to create an experience that engaged the senses, reflected taste, and impressed guests quietly. Preparation required immense effort. Cooks and kitchen staff spent hours crafting each dish. They balanced flavors, textures, and presentation. Pastry chefs created elaborate tarts and cakes adorned with intricate designs. Carvers sliced meat with precision to reveal tender textures without disturbing the dish's appearance. Every plate that left the kitchen was a deliberate statement of skill, wealth, and attention to detail. The household displayed not just food, but the capacity to coordinate labor, resources, and artistry. Even serving was part of the performance. Victorian dining staff moved quietly and efficiently. Waiters presented each dish with grace, ensuring it reached the correct guest at the appropriate moment. Bowls were lifted carefully, trays were held steadily, plates were placed exactly where intended. Every action was meant to appear effortless, further enhancing the illusion that luxury was natural and abundant. The staff remained almost invisible in their precision, their presence a silent backbone to the evening's display. Wine and beverages were selected with equal care. Hosts might offer vintage wines, carefully paired with specific courses to highlight subtle flavors. Hot beverages like tea or coffee were served in matching porcelain cups, often accompanied by silver spoons or small sugar bowls. The choice of drink, its presentation, and the timing of service all contributed to the impression of calm sophistication. Conversation during dinner was soft, deliberate, and polite. Often topics revolved around art, literature, travel, or social news. Guests and hosts exchanged subtle observations, gently complimented one another, or shared anecdotes that reflected cultural awareness. The goal was never to dominate conversation or speak loudly. Silence, pauses, and measured words all carried meaning. A well-timed observation could signal intelligence, refinement, or social tact as effectively as a visual display of wealth. Lighting also played a crucial role. Candles or gas lamps were positioned to create warm, steady illumination, highlighting the table and its carefully arranged contents. Shadows danced gently across the surface, adding depth and calm to the scene.
Light reflected off polished silver, crystal, and glassware, giving the room a sense of quiet magic. It wasn't dramatic in the modern sense, but it was atmospheric, soft, and carefully controlled. Dining etiquette was nearly as complex as the menu itself. Guests were expected to know which fork to use, how to hold glasses, and when to speak. Hosts ensured that each person felt observed but not scrutinized. Even small gestures, a napkin folded neatly in one's lap, a spoon placed correctly on a plate, a polite nod of acknowledgement, were all part of the performance. Mastery of etiquette reflected subtle education and a refined upbringing, reinforcing status without ostentation. The meal itself was slow, deliberate, and structured to encourage lingering. Each course gave guests time to admire not just the food, but the arrangement of the table, the artistry of the dishes, and the composure of fellow diners. Time was in itself a luxury. Those who could afford to eat slowly, savor each bite, and participate in prolonged, calm conversation demonstrated both refinement and leisure. Some households went further, incorporating seasonal decorations into their table displays. Flowers in subtle arrangements, seasonal fruits, or ornamental greenery enhanced the visual appeal. Even small touches, such as a perfectly folded napkin or a delicately carved butter dish, contributed to the quiet elegance of the meal. These touches suggested attentiveness, taste, and the ability to orchestrate even minor details with care. For children and younger guests, dining served as a gentle lesson in social expectation. They learned the rhythm of meals, the importance of posture, the art of conversation, and the subtle language of observation. These early experiences shaped their understanding of society, preparing them to participate in the same rituals as adults.
Some Victorian families used meals to subtly demonstrate their global connections. Ingredients sourced from distant lands, spices from India, fruits from the Caribbean, delicacies from Europe, hinted at trade networks and travel experiences. A single exotic fruit could spark admiration, signaling not only wealth but curiosity and access. The table became a map of the world, presented quietly, in calm succession, for those observant enough to notice. In private dinners, hosts often introduced small entertainments to accompany the meal. Gentle music might play in the background, a harp or piano softly filling the room. Short readings from poetry or literature could be shared between courses. These additions, carefully timed, enhanced the atmosphere without drawing attention away from the table itself. The performance remained slow, deliberate, and soothing, a quiet ballet of refinement. Even the act of clearing the table was choreographed. Staff moved with precision, removing empty dishes, replenishing beverages, and preparing the next course. The flow of the evening continued seamlessly, almost unnoticed, reinforcing the idea that luxury and refinement were effortless, even though they required enormous effort behind the scenes. And as the meal concluded, the subtle performance of wealth persisted. Desserts were presented with care, cups of tea were offered, and small courtesies exchanged. Guests departed at the right time, leaving with a gentle impression of calm, deliberate sophistication. The dining experience, like so many other elements of Victorian life, left an enduring impression. Wealth and taste were demonstrated not through noise or extravagance alone, but through thoughtful orchestration of everyday activities. The dining table, in this sense, became a stage where manners, objects, food, and time converged. Each meal was a quiet story of refinement, a performance designed to impress without effort, and a ritual that reinforced the social hierarchy subtly but consistently. Even today, imagining such evenings evokes a soft rhythm of calm, meticulous, and soothing activity.
And so, as the candlelight flickers in our mind's eye, we drift toward the next chapter, where the Victorians extend their love of display even further into gardens, outdoor spaces, and the very landscaping of their estates, turning nature itself into a quiet stage for admiration. For the wealthy Victorians, the world outside their walls was just as important as the interior spaces they meticulously curated. Houses, drawing rooms, wardrobes, cabinets of curiosities, and elaborate dining tables were all significant, yes, but a true demonstration of refinement extended into the very earth surrounding one's home. Gardens, lawns, and outdoor landscapes became silent, living stages, expansive theaters in which wealth, taste, and social standing were communicated without a single word. Victorian gardens were far more than places to grow food or enjoy leisure. They were carefully designed displays where plants, paths, and decorations worked in unison to create an atmosphere of serene control. A visitor approaching a wealthy estate would first notice the exterior, a sweep of manicured lawn, symmetrical flower beds, or the gentle curvature of a driveway leading to the house. The layout was intentional, a visual poem of order and refinement, hinting that the family inside valued structure, beauty, and a touch of theatricality. Paths were rarely arbitrary. Gravel or brick walkways guided visitors slowly through the grounds, encouraging them to pause, admire, and take in the surroundings at a measured pace. Stone benches, sometimes carved with delicate patterns or family crests, appeared strategically along the way, inviting gentle rest while maintaining aesthetic balance. Each curve, each turn, each planted border spoke quietly of thoughtfulness and planning. Trees and shrubs were chosen as carefully as furniture or artwork. Rare species imported from abroad symbolized access to distant lands and an appreciation for exotic flora. A flowering tree might be placed at the precise angle to catch morning light, while a carefully pruned hedge created a sense of order and elegance. Topiary became particularly popular, transforming nature itself into a living sculpture, shaped and maintained with meticulous care. Watching these shapes required patience and a gentle eye, reinforcing the quiet, contemplative pace valued by the Victorians. Flower beds were arranged both with harmony and subtle drama in mind. Colors were coordinated, transitions between shades considered carefully, and plant heights balanced to create pleasing layers. Seasonal blooms were anticipated months in advance, ensuring that visitors at any time of year would encounter beauty and order. Exotic blooms, often nurtured in heated greenhouses, added an extra dimension, offering glimpses of rare and unusual species. Flowers were not merely decorative, they were status symbols. Water features added another layer to this outdoor theater. Small fountains, trickling streams, and reflective ponds introduced movement and sound to the otherwise still environment. The gentle murmur of water created a calming ambiance, softening the landscape and inviting visitors to linger in thought. A pond carefully stocked with ornamental fish, such as goldfish or koi, offered both visual pleasure and a quiet demonstration of the household's ability to maintain controlled ecosystems.
Statues, busts, and garden ornaments punctuated the landscape. Marble figures might appear amidst flower beds, sometimes classical, sometimes whimsical. Birds, animals, or mythical creatures carved in stone gave the gardens personality while reinforcing a family's aesthetic tastes. Visitors moving through the grounds would encounter these sculptures gradually, as if the garden were narrating a silent story, guiding the eye and encouraging contemplation. Every object was deliberate, every placement meaningful. The estate itself often dictated the scope of these outdoor displays. Larger properties allowed for expansive lawns, rolling meadows, and long drives lined with ornamental trees.
Estates incorporated vistas deliberately framed to impress visitors from the first glimpse at the driveway. Gardens were designed to feel natural yet refined, balancing the appearance of untamed beauty with human control. The subtle art of landscape design became a crucial tool for demonstrating social standing. Seasonality played a vital role. Spring might bring gentle pastels, fresh blooms, and a sense of awakening. Summer invited full foliage, fragrant blossoms, and shady corners for quiet relaxation. Autumn painted landscapes in warm hues of gold, amber, and crimson, while winter emphasized structure, evergreen foliage, and subtle contrasts of snow against sculpted trees. Maintaining beauty throughout the seasons was not merely practical, it was performative. Wealthy families demonstrated endurance and consistency, a quiet commitment to refinement no matter the month. Garden parties emerged as a particularly elegant method of showcasing outdoor wealth. These events were slow, deliberate, and carefully curated. Guests wandered along paths, paused by fountains, admired rare flowers, and moved from one carefully staged area to another. Gentle music, often played by small ensembles or a distant piano, added rhythm without intrusion. Refreshments were served on trays, sometimes decorated with flowers or lace, allowing visitors to enjoy the surroundings while partaking in calm indulgence. Nothing was rushed. Everything was orchestrated to suggest leisure and sophistication. Paths through the garden often led to smaller rooms outdoors, like summer houses, gazebos, or pergolas. These spaces allowed guests to pause, converse, or quietly observe the garden from different perspectives. A gazebo tucked beneath a flowering arbor invited reflection. A pergola covered with climbing roses created a private nook for soft conversation. The architecture of these outdoor spaces mirrored the interiors of the home, deliberate, harmonious, and designed to convey status without ostentation. Lighting added another layer to the outdoor stage. Lanterns, candles, and early gas lamps were placed along pathways and in garden corners to create soft illumination in the evening. Shadows danced among trees and shrubs, highlighting texture and depth while preserving the quiet, intimate atmosphere. Guests experienced the garden differently at night, discovering details previously hidden in daylight. These subtle effects reinforced the impression that the estate was a realm of elegance, thoughtfulness, and gentle spectacle. The Victorians' love for horticulture also extended to greenhouses and conservatories. Exotic plants, often requiring precise temperature and humidity control, flourished under glass. These indoor gardens allowed families to enjoy tropical plants year-round and provided additional opportunities to impress guests. Palm trees, orchids, and rare flowering plants were arranged thoughtfully, echoing the careful display seen inside the home. Conservatories became an intersection of wealth, curiosity, and artistry, showcasing both resources and intellect. Animals, too, played a part in the garden stage. Peacocks, small ornamental birds, or carefully bred rabbits could roam designated areas, adding life and quiet spectacle. Watching these creatures, observing their colors, and noting their behavior became part of the meditative rhythm of the estate. Animals functioned as living adornments, subtle companions in the gentle performance of wealth and refinement. Even leisure activities were orchestrated within the garden. Gentle walks along winding paths, games like croquet or bowls, and carefully timed picnics allowed guests to participate in slow, deliberate entertainment. Every movement, pause, and gesture was part of the broader tableau, reinforcing the estate's role as a cultivated environment. Activities were meant to feel natural, yet they were invariably the result of careful planning. The gardens often served as a bridge between indoor and outdoor display. Drawing rooms opened onto terraces or lawns. Conservatories extended the feeling of cultivated elegance beyond walls. Pathways guided the eye and the feet, creating a sense of journey and discovery. A visitor's experience was a narrative. Each turn revealed beauty, each pause allowed reflection, each glance invited admiration. Wealth and refinement were embedded in the rhythm of the walk itself. Seasonal events also influenced garden design. Spring and summer flower shows, autumn harvest displays, and winter illuminations allowed families to align outdoor spaces with social calendars. Even the smallest decorative details, arrangement of blooms, positioning of benches, or placement of lanterns, reflected an ongoing concern with impression. These arrangements required not only taste, but also significant resources, skilled gardeners, imported plants, and thoughtful labor. Gardens became an extension of the domestic interior. They mirrored the deliberate, curated quality of drawing rooms, cabinets of curiosities, and dining tables. Every element was harmonious. Every path led purposefully. Every plant, sculpture, and water feature worked together to create a sense of calm, beauty, and controlled abundance. Outdoor spaces were neither chaotic nor purely functional. They were a deliberate statement, a slow and gentle exhibition of wealth and taste. As we step back from the carefully pruned shrubs, the soft murmur of water features, and the gentle sway of flowers in the breeze, it is easy to see the overarching pattern of Victorian life. Wealth was not merely displayed in objects, experiences, or gardens. It extended into a subtle, almost invisible realm, social recognition. The wealthy Victorians had mastered the art of being seen, being admired, and being understood, all without overtly stating their worth. Every carriage ride, every dinner, every wardrobe choice, every cabinet of curiosities, every carefully arranged flower bed, all of these were threads in a vast, quiet tapestry woven to communicate status, taste, and refinement. At its core, Victorian recognition was about observation. Families understood that society functioned on the principle of noticing the small things. It wasn't about the loudest voice in the room or the flashiest display of money. It was about the slow, deliberate cues that informed others of your place, your taste, and your capability. A gentleman's perfectly aligned cuff, a lady's tilt of her hat, or the precise arrangement of a floral centerpiece all spoke volumes. Wealth was performed as much as it was possessed. Visitors, acquaintances, and even casual passers-by absorbed these performances. They watched how people moved, how they interacted, and how they curated their environments. The rich had learned that recognition could be earned through subtlety. A well-timed gesture, a delicate compliment, a quiet show of skill or knowledge, these all communicated refinement. The ultimate goal was admiration that felt natural, effortless, and inevitable. One of the most fascinating aspects of this social language was its inclusivity and exclusivity at once. Everyone could observe, but only a few could participate. A person could admire the details of a grand drawing room, but unless they understood the references, the furniture styles, the artwork, the historical nods, they were outsiders. Similarly, attending a gallery, a garden promenade, or a dinner party required knowledge of etiquette, decorum, and the subtle rhythms of social interaction. Recognition wasn't just given, it was earned and often silently acknowledged. The Victorian home became a theater for these performances. Guests moved from room to room, noting the objects on display, the arrangement of furniture, the care in table settings, and the careful attention to seasonal detail. Hosts subtly guided visitors, allowing them to admire without feeling led or pressured. Conversation flowed gently, punctuated with soft laughter, measured compliments, and anecdotes designed to reveal taste and intellect.
Everything was deliberate, yet nothing felt forced. Even the outdoors continued this narrative. Gardens, conservatories, and promenades offered additional stages for social recognition. The way someone walked, the angle at which they viewed a fountain, or the gentle handling of a rare flower all demonstrated awareness, grace, and refinement. Families orchestrated these spaces to encourage lingering, observation, and gentle admiration.
Recognition extended to events as well. Social gatherings, whether dinners, garden parties, or charity balls, were carefully choreographed to maximize subtle display. Guests learned to perform attentiveness, politeness, and curiosity. They watched, they listened, and they responded with measured praise. Hosts, in turn, observed guests' reactions, subtly acknowledging comprehension and appreciation without drawing attention to it. This exchange reinforced hierarchy while maintaining calm elegance. It was, in essence, an unspoken conversation, conducted entirely through behavior, observation, and decorum. The art of recognition also thrived in fashion and attire. The rich understood that clothing could communicate much more than style. It was an ongoing dialogue. Accessories, colors, fabrics, and cuts signaled wealth, intellect, and taste. A well-chosen hat or perfectly pleated gown demonstrated understanding of social codes and attention to detail. Men, too, relied on subtle cues: a pocket watch, a polished shoe, the fit of a waistcoat, all contributing to a silent language understood by peers. These signals were constant, yet delicate, allowing wealth to speak without the need for proclamation. Objects and collections reinforced this communication. Cabinets of curiosities, exotic artifacts, and rare specimens became silent testimonies of knowledge, connections, and refinement. Visitors could read these displays, understanding a family's global reach, intellectual pursuits, and attention to detail, all without words. The wealthiest Victorians were not merely collecting, they were crafting an environment that educated observers on both taste and social hierarchy. Dining, too, played a vital role in this unspoken performance. Every course, every utensil, every arrangement of flowers, and every measured movement contributed to the demonstration of refinement. The rhythm of a meal, the slow progression, the quiet observation, the carefully timed conversation reinforced status. Guests were invited to participate in a carefully orchestrated experience, learning through observation and subtle interaction. Meals became calm stages on which wealth, etiquette, and taste were displayed naturally, almost invisibly. Travel and experiences continued this delicate orchestration. Holidays, promenades, operas, and gallery visits were not merely enjoyable, they were subtle social signals. Those who understood the rhythm of such activities recognized the distinction between leisure and indulgence, between the ordinary and the curated. Knowledge of etiquette and engagement in these experiences became a form of social literacy, a way to participate in the unspoken dialogue of recognition. Recognition ultimately relied on a gentle balance between visibility and restraint. The richest families knew that overt display could feel crass or forced. The goal was admiration that appeared organic, effortless, and inevitable. By choreographing every detail, from the tilt of a hat to the placement of a flower, from the arrangement of a dinner table to the design of a garden, the Victorians created an entire world in which wealth spoke softly but clearly. The audience absorbed, acknowledged, and appreciated, often without realizing how carefully the performance had been staged. It is worth noting that this culture of recognition had a meditative quality.
The slow observation, gentle conversation, and deliberate pacing created a rhythm that soothed and calmed. A visitor who wandered through a Victorian estate, observed its curated rooms, promenaded through its gardens, or lingered at a well-set table would often find themselves immersed in a quiet, reflective experience. Wealth, etiquette, and taste merged into a gentle narrative that could be experienced almost like a story unfolding at a measured pace. A story that invited admiration without pressure. And so, as our journey comes to a close, we see the full scope of Victorian performance. Wealth was not a loud, brash statement. It was an orchestrated life, performed through fashion, objects, experiences, dining, gardens, and the quiet choreography of social interaction. It was subtle, deliberate, and immersive, a world in which status spoke softly, naturally, and irresistibly. We leave behind images of glimmering cabinets, flowing gowns, softly lit tables, winding garden paths, and measured conversation. We leave behind the slow elegance of a life staged for observation and recognition. And as we drift from these visions, we carry with us a gentle understanding that in the Victorian world, wealth was not merely possessed, it was lived, observed, and quietly admired, weaving its way into the rhythm of daily existence with subtle brilliance.